North of Siberia and west of Alaska, the Arctic Ocean spreads outward in long, unbroken distances. For most of the year, it is not open water but a shifting plain of ice. Pressure ridges rise without warning. Leads open and close in silence. The horizon remains level and white, interrupted only by wind-driven snow and the occasional dark line of distant pack. In late summer, the light lingers for hours. By autumn, it shortens. Winter brings a subdued sun and extended darkness. Temperatures fall steadily below freezing. Sea ice thickens, binding the surface into a moving field that drifts with wind and current. Nothing remains fixed for long. In 1913, this region was still loosely charted. Large sections of the Beaufort and Chukchi seas were incomplete on maps. Expeditions moved through these waters slowly, dependent on hull strength, coal reserves, and weather. Once caught in the pack, a vessel no longer followed its intended course. It followed the ice. Here, distance is measured not only in miles but in days of drift. A camp established in one position might be carried elsewhere without notice. Navigation becomes estimation. Direction loses certainty. It was into this moving landscape that a wooden ship named Karluk entered during the Canadian Arctic Expedition of 1913. The Canadian Arctic Expedition was organized in 1913 under the leadership of Vilhjalmur Stefansson. Its purpose was both scientific and geographic. One branch of the expedition would conduct research along the northern coast of Canada. The other, led by Stefansson himself, would attempt to explore and chart unknown regions of the Arctic Ocean west of the Canadian archipelago. To support these objectives, the expedition acquired a vessel named Karluk. Originally built in 1884 as a whaling ship, the Karluk was constructed of wood, reinforced for ice conditions but not designed as a modern icebreaker. By 1913, she was nearly 30 years old. Her hull had already endured years in northern waters. The ship departed from Esquimalt, British Columbia, in June 1913. On board were scientists, sailors, engineers, and Inupiat families who had been hired as hunters and seamstresses. In total, more than 20 people would become part of the drifting party. Among them was Captain Robert Bartlett, an experienced ice navigator from Newfoundland who had previously sailed with Robert Peary in Greenland. Bartlett commanded the Karluk, while Stefansson directed the expedition as a whole. The ship moved north through the Bering Strait and into the Beaufort Sea. Early progress was slowed by pack ice. Even in late summer, the Arctic does not fully release its grip. The Karluk pushed forward carefully, relying on leads, narrow openings in the ice, to advance. By August 1913, heavy pack ice surrounded the vessel. Despite efforts to maneuver, the ship became trapped. The ice closed around the hull and held it in place. This was not uncommon in Arctic travel. Ships could become temporarily beset and later break free. The crew expected that shifting winds or currents might open a channel. Instead, the ice began to drift westward. With the Karluk embedded in the pack, the ship drifted with it. Control of navigation was effectively lost. During this period, Stefansson left the ship with a small party to hunt caribou on the Alaskan coast. His intention was to secure fresh meat and return. While he was away, the ice carried the Karluk farther from land. Worsening conditions made return difficult. Stefansson would never rejoin the ship. Leadership at sea remained with Captain Bartlett. As autumn progressed, the drift continued. The Karluk moved slowly across the Arctic Ocean, carried away from the Canadian mainland and toward Siberian waters. Temperatures fell. Ice pressure increased around the hull. The crew began transferring supplies from the hold onto the ice as a precaution. Tents, food, coal, and sledging equipment were unloaded and organized into depots on the frozen surface beside the ship. By December 1913, the situation had changed from inconvenience to threat. The ice no longer merely surrounded the vessel, it pressed against it. Pressure ridges formed nearby, driven by wind and shifting currents. Wooden timbers began to strain under force. Captain Bartlett ordered further preparations for abandonment. Lifeboats were secured on the ice. Scientific records were packed. Dogs were readied for hauling. The crew established routines on the ice itself, anticipating that the ship might not survive the winter. On January 10, 1914, the pressure intensified. The hull began to splinter. Water entered the ship. Pumps operated continuously but could not reverse the damage. Over the next day, the crew removed the remaining supplies. By January 11, the Karluk was fatally compromised. On January 11, 1914, the ship that had carried them north was crushed by the ice and sank beneath the frozen surface. The expedition had become a drifting camp on the Arctic Ocean. When the Karluk disappeared beneath the ice on January 11, 1914, it left behind no solid ground and no fixed position. The camp stood on sea ice several feet thick, drifting westward across the Arctic Ocean. Beneath it lay deep water. Around it stretched pressure ridges and fractured plains of snow. Captain Robert Bartlett took immediate control of the situation. The remaining party numbered more than 20, including sailors, scientists, an Inupiat hunter, and 2 children. Supplies saved from the ship were arranged into organized stores: flour, pemmican, tinned goods, coal, rifles, ammunition, sledges, and tents. The dogs were secured. Watches were established. The ice was not stable terrain. It cracked without warning. Leads of open water could form between one floe and the next. At night, the sound of shifting pressure carried across the camp like distant thunder. The men slept in tents pitched on a surface that moved beneath them. The drifting continued. Calculations suggested that the camp was being carried toward Wrangel Island, a remote landmass north of Siberia. It was several dozen miles away, but distance on sea ice was uncertain. The direction of drift could change. Bartlett determined that remaining indefinitely on the drifting floe was not sustainable. The ice might fracture in warmer months, and food supplies were finite. A decision was made to attempt a march toward Wrangel Island once daylight returned and conditions allowed. Before that plan could be executed, the camp faced its first losses. In early February, a small party led by Alastair Mackay left the main group, attempting to walk toward land independently. They did not return. Their fate remains unknown. The remaining members consolidated their resources. Sledges were repaired. Loads were calculated by weight. Rations were measured carefully. The expedition had shifted from exploration to survival. Movement was now necessary, but it would require crossing a moving ocean of ice. After the loss of the independent party in February, Captain Robert Bartlett tightened discipline within the camp. No one would leave again without direct order. The drifting ice remained their platform, but it could not remain their home. By mid-February 1914, preparations for movement were complete. The camp had drifted closer to Wrangel Island, though exact distance was difficult to determine. Estimates ranged between 40 and 100 miles. On February 18, Bartlett ordered the main party to begin hauling supplies toward land. Progress was slow from the first day. The surface was not a smooth plain. It consisted of pressure ridges, jagged walls of ice formed by colliding floes, interrupted by stretches of broken fragments and open leads of water. Sledges had to be unloaded and carried piece by piece over the ridges. In some areas, planks were laid to bridge narrow gaps. In others, men waited for water to refreeze. The temperature remained far below freezing. Wind increased exposure. Frostbite was a constant risk. Each day's movement covered only a few miles, sometimes less. At night, tents were pitched quickly, and snow blocks were used as windbreaks. Rations were issued according to measured quantities established after the ship's sinking. Food consisted mainly of pemmican, flour, biscuits, and occasional seal or polar bear meat when hunting succeeded. The Inupiat hunter, John Hadley, played a critical role in securing fresh meat. Without successful hunts, caloric intake would have declined sharply. Fuel was limited, cooking was efficient and minimal. The ice itself continued to drift during their march. In some cases, distance gained in one direction was partially lost overnight as the flow shifted. Navigation required constant correction. Bartlett and the expedition's navigator used sextant readings when weather allowed, but cloud cover often prevented accurate observations. The march lasted weeks. Exhaustion accumulated gradually. Sledges broke and were repaired. Clothing stiffened with frost. Faces were windburned. There were no dramatic events, only repetition, load, haul, rest, measure, repeat. By early March, the party sighted Wrangel Island more clearly. The landmass appeared low and distant, but distinct against the horizon. Reaching it, however, required crossing unstable ice near the coast. Leads widened as they approached shore, where tidal movement fractured the surface. On March 12, 1914, after nearly 3 weeks of travel, the main party stepped onto solid ground on the southern coast of Wrangel Island. The relief was not expressive. It was practical. Land offered stability and the possibility of more reliable hunting. The island itself was barren and snow-covered. No permanent settlements existed. It had been visited previously by explorers, but it remained uninhabited. The survivors established a camp using salvaged canvas and materials carried from the Karluk. Snow houses were constructed to supplement tents. Food stores were reorganized again, this time with the expectation of a long wait. The winter did not end immediately upon arrival. March and April remained cold. Hunting became the central activity. Seals, polar bears, and foxes were taken when possible. Ammunition was conserved. Every cartridge mattered. Discipline was maintained. Bartlett enforced routines. Duties rotated: hunting, cooking, repairing clothing, tending dogs, reinforcing shelter walls. Scientific instruments salvaged from the ship were used sparingly to record weather and position. Journals were kept. Documentation continued even in reduced circumstances. Morale was uneven but controlled. The group understood that rescue would not come automatically. They were far from regular shipping lanes. Stephenson had not returned. The expedition's southern support vessels were distant. Communication was non-existent. By April, Bartlett concluded that waiting passively was too uncertain. Wrangel Island lay roughly 90 miles from the Siberian coast at its nearest point. Beyond that coast were settlements where assistance might be obtained. Remaining through another winter without outside contact posed serious risk. Bartlett announced his intention to attempt a journey across the ice to Siberia with a single companion. He selected Kataktovik, an Inupiat hunter familiar with Arctic travel. The decision reduced the group's immediate leadership but offered the only realistic chance of organized rescue. On April 18, 1914, Bartlett and Kataktovik departed Wrangel Island with sledges and limited supplies. The remaining survivors stayed behind, instructed to maintain camp, conserve ammunition, and continue hunting. The camp on Wrangel Island settled into waiting. Spring approached slowly. Ice near the coast shifted with increasing frequency. The men adjusted shelters accordingly. Dogs were rationed carefully. Some would later be slaughtered for food as necessity demanded. Time became measured in weather changes and successful hunts. Letters were written and stored in case of recovery. Records were kept with precision. The discipline established after the ship's loss continued on land. The immediate crisis of drifting ice had ended, but uncertainty had not. Survival was now tied to endurance and the success of a journey unfolding far beyond the horizon. When Captain Robert Bartlett left Wrangel Island on April 18, 1914, he carried limited provisions, a rifle, navigation instruments, and a written record of the survivors remaining behind. With him was Kataktovik, an Inupiat hunter whose experience with sea ice was essential. The distance to the Siberian coast was estimated at roughly 90 miles, but in Arctic conditions, distance alone did not determine difficulty. The surface between Wrangel Island and Siberia was unstable spring ice. Warmer temperatures weakened its structure. Leads opened unpredictably. Pressure ridges formed where flows converged. Travel required constant reassessment of direction and load. The two men advanced in stages, hauling their sledge, often retracing steps when confronted with open water. At times they waited for thin ice to thicken enough to support weight. Hunting supplemented their rations when possible, though opportunities were limited during travel. After several weeks, they reached the Siberian mainland near Cape Vankerem. From there, they continued on foot to coastal Chukchi settlements. Communication required translation through local intermediaries. Bartlett requested transport southward to reach telegraph lines that could alert authorities. The journey did not end at landfall. Bartlett traveled overland and by coastal vessel across eastern Siberia, eventually reaching Alaska. From there he secured passage to Nome, where he was able to arrange a rescue effort. Meanwhile, on Wrangel Island, the remaining members of the Karluk party continued to endure isolation. Without Bartlett, leadership shifted among senior members, including the expedition's chief engineer and scientists. Hunting remained central to survival. Foxes and polar bears were taken when ammunition allowed. At times food was sufficient, at others it was rationed more strictly. One member, Bertram Mackay, had been lost earlier with the Independent Party. On the island itself, conditions gradually weakened several others. Illness and physical exhaustion became more visible as months passed. By late summer 1914, more than half a year had elapsed since the Karluk sank. The survivors could not know how close rescue efforts had come, or how many attempts might fail before success. Summer on Wrangel Island did not bring comfort. Snow receded in patches, exposing gravel and low tundra, but the island remained remote and wind-exposed. Sea ice loosened offshore, breaking into moving fields. Any attempt to depart without a vessel was no longer possible. The survivors remained dependent on hunting and on the success of Captain Robert Bartlett's effort to bring help. The group had been reduced in number since the sinking of the Karluk. The three men who had left in February, Alastair Mackay, James Murray, and Henri Buchat, had not been seen again. On the island, physical strain accumulated. Diet relied heavily on game secured with limited ammunition. Polar bear meat provided necessary calories, but fresh supplies were inconsistent. When hunting failed, rations tightened. Illness appeared gradually. Lorne Knight, the expedition's geologist, showed signs consistent with scurvy during the spring. Fresh meat provided some prevention, yet his condition worsened. Weakness limited his mobility. Other members assumed greater workloads, maintaining shelters and continuing hunting expeditions along the coast. Leadership on the island required balance. Authority rotated among senior members, but discipline remained structured. Journals were kept. Weather conditions were recorded. Ammunition counts were tracked carefully. Dogs were managed with increasing difficulty as food stores fluctuated. Some were eventually killed to supplement human rations. The psychological weight of isolation intensified during this period. Months had passed without communication. The European war that began in August 1914 was unknown to them. Their focus remained local: wind direction, animal tracks, remaining flour, and the durability of shelter walls. In September, Lorne Knight's condition deteriorated sharply. Despite continued care from the others, he died on September 23, 1914. His death reduced the group further and underscored the limits of endurance. The burial was practical and quiet. By autumn, ice began forming again along the coast. The return of colder temperatures signaled that another winter was approaching. Supplies were reassessed. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Hunting success became less predictable. Throughout this time, rescue vessels had attempted to reach the island. Several ships were turned back by heavy ice. Only persistent effort extended the search into late summer. On September 7, 1914, the schooner King Winch reached Wrangel Island. It located the remaining survivors and evacuated them after nearly 9 months of isolation. The departure was orderly. Equipment that could not be carried was left behind. Records were secured. The men boarded without ceremony. The schooner King Winch, commanded by Captain Olaf Swenson, reached Wrangel Island in early September 1914 after previous rescue attempts had failed due to heavy ice. The vessel approached cautiously through broken floes and anchored offshore. A landing party confirmed the presence of the survivors. Those remaining from the Karluk expedition were transported aboard in stages. Their number had been reduced by 4 deaths, 3 lost during the attempt to leave the drifting ice in February, and 1 on the island in September. The others were physically weakened but capable of travel. Equipment and scientific records that had survived since January were brought with them. From Wrangel Island, the King Winch sailed south toward Alaska. The Arctic season was closing, new ice was beginning to form. The timing of the rescue left little margin. Within weeks, navigation would have been significantly more difficult. Captain Robert Bartlett, who had traveled across Siberia and Alaska to secure assistance, was not aboard the rescue vessel at the moment of evacuation. He later reunited with the survivors in Nome. His overland journey had taken months and had depended on cooperation from local Siberian communities and maritime support along the Bering Sea coast. The evacuation concluded the immediate crisis that had begun when the Karluk was crushed by ice on January 11, 1914. The survivors had endured drifting pack ice, a prolonged march over frozen ocean, and isolation on an uninhabited Arctic island. Their return did not erase the losses. It marked the end of exposure, not the end of consequence. The Karluk expedition remains a record of endurance in one of the planet's most unforgiving regions. Scientific observations, maps, and journals preserved the experiences of the crew and passengers. Their drift across the Arctic Ocean, months of travel over unstable ice, and long stay on Wrangel Island provide a detailed account of human survival under extreme isolation. Historians and Arctic researchers have studied the expedition as an example of discipline, planning, and the limitations imposed by nature. Captain Robert Bartlett's leadership, combined with the practical skills of Inupiat hunters and the careful rationing of supplies, allowed a portion of the group to survive despite the loss of life. The story of the Karluk is quiet in its lessons. Endurance is measured not in triumph but in persistence, observation, and restraint. The Arctic claimed the ship, challenged those aboard, and recorded their struggle in cold, unbroken silence. The human presence on the drifting ice has long since disappeared, leaving only the documentation of their experience and the historical imprint of survival at the edge of the world.